All right, well, we're going to call the meeting to order here. This is the City Council work session in the City of Edina. We're in the City Hall Community Room. It is Tuesday, April 2nd, 2024, 5:31 p.m. Member Risser, as we know, she's on the screen. She'll be participating in the meeting by video conference methodology because she's been advised by a healthcare professional against being in a public place for medical reasons, and that also allows us to have her participate remotely. So I'm going to call the meeting to order, and I'm going to ask our clerk Sharon Ellison to call the roll of the council.
Councilmember Agnew.
Here.
Councilmember Jackson.
Here.
Councilmember Pierce.
Here.
Councilmember Risser.
Here.
Here. Having provided that roll call, now we're going to turn to the only purpose we have this evening in work session is gathering to discuss the design experience guidelines, and we've got two people that were integrally involved in this effort with us. I'm going to turn to Carrie Teague first to introduce the matter, and then introduce our guests as well, that all of us know.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, members of council. What I thought I'd do is just go through the PowerPoint, hit on history, planning in the Southdale district, really just in the last 20 years, because of much longer history, but we're just going to go back 20 years. Talk a little bit about the intent of the guidelines, provide some examples of projects that have been approved but not built, and examples of projects that have been approved and built, and then get into discussion about next steps and where we want to go with that. So to start with the history, in the last 20 years, starting with the 2005 Land Use and Transportation Study. So both Michael and Mike were on the Planning Commission when this document was created, and I believe Mike was on the Community Task Force that was also part of that. So it was the Transportation Commission and Planning Commission, along with Hoisington Kogler, that prepared this study. The plan was received. It wasn't formally approved by the City Council, so it didn't necessarily have standing. Next. So then we get into the 2008 Comprehensive Plan. So as you know, at this time, there was, with the economy at that time, there wasn't a lot of development happening. And when the comprehensive plan was done, the Southdale area was labeled as an area that had potential change. So we didn't examine that area specifically. When the comprehensive plan was approved in 2008, it wasn't, to be quite frank, it wasn't very forward looking. It was more of a approval of the zoning ordinance. The densities were set very low. It was actually a different plan from what the Planning Commission had initially recommended. So at that time, we could go to the next one.
Hold on a second. As 4 and 5, they were seen as different planning areas on that map?
They were,
Okay.
yeah. West side of France is the dividing line, and as you can see, number 4 didn't even incorporate the entirety of the Southdale district. Over time, that didn't expand. As development started to occur, 2010, 2011, 2012, most of the redevelopment projects that we were seeing needed a comprehensive plan amendment. From 2008 to 2018, I believe our total was 27-ish comprehensive plan amendments, partially because the densities that were established were quite low, and we also had height restrictions. So anytime a project proposed something that was taller than our zoning ordinance, the comprehensive plan also regulated height. That was done intentionally also. So quite a few comprehensive plan amendments and rezoning. So in 2015, as a result of a proposal at the 7200 and 7250 France project, the council requested that a work group be created to develop a tool for the Planning Commission and City Council to consider when they're looking at these rezoning and comprehensive plan amendments. We really didn't have a tool to consider those. Next slide. So there were 7 members that were appointed by the City Council and Planning Commission. Michael Schroeder was appointed as the facilitator of that group. a member of the Chamber of Commerce, a resident, developer, and 3 members of the Planning Commission. At our kickoff meeting, our first public meeting, we also selected 6 additional members to that working group, and they were self-appointed. There were 3 residents from the neighborhood to the west, and 3 interested. Well, Ben Martin was part of Southdale, Rob Grubin was representing the Southdale Fairview Hospital, and Jim Nelson, just a developer and property owner in the area. So that was the team of 13 members that were appointed. And next slide. So the result of that work were guiding principles for development. So what you see on the right was what was created for every developer that wanted to do a rezoning or a comp plan change. They had to respond to these guiding principles. So that was the tool that we were using at that time to consider those rezonings, comp plan changes. The council supported those guiding principles there. They were officially approved, adopted by the city council, and they supported that work and asked the group to move to the next phase, which was creating a graphic vision of those principles. At that time, the city hired architecture field office. Interviews were held by the working group, and we selected that. Mick Johnson of AFO to lead that process. Why don't we go to the next slide? So then putting it all together, as we were nearing the start of the 2018 comprehensive plan, it was decided that that working group would continue on. That would be the working group for the development of the Southdale District Plan. That working group was expanded to, I didn't look at the exact number, but it doubled in size. Again, was residents and interested business interest in the district. Beco Associates was hired as the consultant for the overall comprehensive plan. So all those groups came together to work on both the design guidelines and the district plan. Next slide. So the comprehensive plan, which included the Southdale District Plan, was approved by the City Council in December of 2018. It was then submitted to Met Council. Took a little while, some back and forth with Met Council. Ultimately, it was approved as part of the comprehensive plan in 2020. And the Greater Southdale Design Guidelines were adopted in March of 2019. They were intentionally left out of the comprehensive plan as a standalone document. The idea was, over time, they could be revisited and amended without having to amend the comprehensive plan. COVID hit shortly after that, and we've never taken up looking at those guidelines. That might be the next step here, is to revisit them. Just to get touch on a little bit of the intention. The intention of the guidelines was to be a tool or a starting point for potential developments, really at the sketch plan point. And we asked Mick Johnson to provide that critique memo that was provided the Planning Commission and City Council. They're guidelines, not ordinances, although we have adopted some of those guidelines into ordinance, like the setbacks, the transparency, and the first floor building height, which we're working on an amendment with the Planning Commission right now. The real focus was on the public realm and how people move through the site, the buildings being somewhat secondary to that public realm. And the idea was that the guidelines would be the tool to determine a PUD. So with each new development, we could create a zoning ordinance specifically for that site using the design guidelines as that tool to help justify the PUD rezoning. So now I'll just quickly walk through a few developments. The first set are projects, again, that were approved but never built. Southdale Office Center, the project that was on the agenda tonight, they've requested a delay on that. But the key element of this project was that public realm through the site. the WUNRF that was established north-south and east-west through the site. And then with breaking the site up into smaller blocks, this project obviously never came to be. And next. Another project that was approved but not built is the 70th in France. Again, designing the site around that public realm in the middle with the both vehicle connections north-south and east-west as long in addition to the public transport or the sidewalk connections. Getting the green space, the 50-foot setback on France, and on 70th, the 30-foot setback. And next. And really, this was the site that started it all, is the 7200. So this is the project that was first approved for the site. Again, centered around the public realm, that east or that north-south, what was to be a WUNRF at that time, that shared pedestrian and vehicle walkway through the site, some townhomes on the left to transition into the neighborhood. There was going to be retail and office on the lower levels with apartments above. There's also not shown here is that east-west connection to France. But again, that project did not come to be. And next slide. We had the revision using those same concepts. The north-south connection wasn't quite as grand as that original proposal, but taking that same concept and expanding the open space, eliminating those townhomes on the west. And then the Bower is a project that's been built. Part of the design guidelines talk about allowing greater height in between France and York. So this was one that height was increased, but it's more about the public realm around the site and how it integrates in with the promenade. It's a 4-sided building. And next. RH, this is one where the main issue with this one was how the building is shaped to the street. They wanted to turn it. Mick in his review wanted it parallel with the street, but again, their guidelines, and it was decided to angle it. So I hear a lot of mixed. Some people like the angle, some people don't, but there's one example. Next, this is the Estelle site where we had the 28-story building proposed. This was what ultimately was developed, essentially a code-compliant plan, but you can see that 50-foot setback where we get the public realm in front of the building. And next, the Fred and the Finch. The Fred did a nice job connecting to the regional trail and Fred Richards, both private and public connections. And then the Finch offered an opportunity for us to get that new public connection to Fred Richards Park. Pentagon Village, another one where we hear mixed reviews on. This one has more surface parking that we typically look for with the design guidelines, where we're trying to bury the parking, not have parking along the street. But so this is kind of a combination. There was a parking deck. Obviously not all of it built out yet. And the Millennium and Homewood Suites, I threw this in. These were developed right as we were in the beginning stages of the design guidelines. But next, just to conclude and get the conversation started, 5 years have passed. We're kind of asking, are they working? Where should we take them? Should they be revisited? The Planning Commission is interested in revisiting them, taking a look and seeing where we're at. So we've got 2 people that have been along for the journey all throughout the last 20 years. So to help us with any experience or questions that you may have, we'll just open it up for discussion.
Good, thank you. I don't know if either of the Michaels has a comment as we embark on this conversation or not.
Only that it's been 20 years.
Ouch.
4 years worth of work on those, Michael.
Yeah.
Sorry to lay out all the years, but I've been here too.
Right,
So.
yes, yes.
I think it might work best just as you all have questions or want to throw ideas out, we can share some thoughts, but that way it's really whatever you need.
Has the planning commission said that what they want to look at in particular with respect to the design experience guide?
No, not in particular. It's more coming from, we have a lot of new commissioners. I think we only have 2 planning commissioners that were around for the last comprehensive plan. So it's kind of an education with the rest of the group for what they are and just taking a fresh look at it.
So
My
Julie,
member Richter has her hand up.
Yes, I do. And I appreciate a lot of the foundational ideas behind the design experience guidelines. If we could go to the US Bank project image that came up, I think one of the fundamental issues that should be examined is when we're talking about really focusing on how people move through a site, what are the consequences to the surrounding edges, and particularly when you're talking about a road like France Avenue? And I really think what happened here is kind of unfortunate in that the building that exists right now, right on France, if you are walking on that sidewalk and you are going in a northerly direction and you don't stop and turn and look purposefully over your shoulder to make sure someone's not turning into that parking lot, you could get wiped out. It is not a good pedestrian experience. And I feel like there's been a lot of focus on what happens inside, but I think it's come at the expense of pedestrian and bike safety along busier routes. And traditionally, you walk down Hopkins, Main Street, it's lovely. You have these blocks where, it's unbroken. But with what's happening here is it seems as if breaking up the space takes precedence over really long established rules where if you had a corner lot, you would want to maintain it in an unbroken way along the busiest street and direct traffic along the less busy road so that you would have your conflict point or your driveway going in there. So that's an issue that I'm concerned about. I'm also concerned when I go over the documents and I do a word search and look for bike or bicycles, they're really not addressed to the same degree as pedestrian pathways. And the emphasis really seems to be on cars and pedestrians, and that may have been logical a few years ago, but I think today we really do need to take another look at that. So I do have concerns. I also, if I were putting this PowerPoint together, I'd add another category, which is completed projects that have been heavily influenced by the Greater Southdale Area Design Guidelines that are outside of it. And I would look at the Wooddale Valley View area, and particularly the project underway on the Old Burley site, where the buildings have really been pushed so close to the sidewalk on Valley View. What should have been a 30-foot setback is a 10-foot setback. And, I think taking a look again at what we're doing and issues concerning safety, and also, thinking about people using sidewalks as needed infrastructure to get from point A to point B and not necessarily as like a recreational stroll, I think would be really helpful for moving forward. Thank you.
so I don't know if that was a question or not.
Well, it was a statement. It's kind of my feedback on these guidelines
Okay.
and just how I see them playing out in Edina. And they might, some of those things might have been unintentional, but I think they are real and they need to be looked at.
So I have some questions. One is sometimes one of the issues that's raised, and I can't think of the specific project, but I was thinking about the 6800 France that we were intended to look at today. And that's the idea of horizontal mixed use as opposed to vertical mixed use. And people will come in and say, well, we've got this site and it's going to have horizontal mixed use, but tell me how you guys looked at the concept of mixed use, and is horizontal mixed use kind of just an excuse to not do vertical mixed use?
Okay, so it actually might be an excuse not to do vertical mixed use, because it is more difficult, it's probably more difficult to finance. So I can see why somebody might think of it that way. I don't think it's particularly bad as long as there's a relationship between buildings. If you look at Centennial Lakes, that was a really good project that was horizontally mixed. I don't know if there's virtually any vertical mixing on that project. So I think there's actually room for both. I think that as we looked at it, we recognized that the ability to perpetuate the use of a single building over its entire lifetime probably demanded that you look at it from a vertical mixed use perspective, so that you're not precluding a use from coming in 20 or 30 years later without having to knock the building down and start over.
And then another question that I had as I was looking.
Julie, can you hear okay?
Yeah, okay. The other question that I had was, when I read the Southdale guidelines, I don't envision medical office buildings. So we've got that visibility on the first floor, and we saw that down in the Cahill area for that medical doctor's office. And they're like, we don't want visibility on the ground floor. We might as well not even have a ground floor because people are in the doctor's offices. How did you guys address medical buildings when you looked at it?
I actually don't recall specifically talking about medical buildings.
We didn't, we didn't talk about specific uses other than residential versus commercial kind of uses.
But that'd still be a valid question though. So with the guidelines having that see-through, or however it's worded on the first level for medical buildings, how would you interpret that?
I think I think one of the questions that Director Teague had asked us is it worth revisiting? Because I think we didn't cover everything. Yeah. And in fact, I can think of projects on the France Avenue corridor where we had anticipated other kinds of uses on the first floor. The senior building that's at 65th originally had all of the kind of common spaces to the building were on that first floor. And during the course of our reviews back at the Planning Commission, it changed, and they started putting residential units on the first floor, which is probably even worse than having medical offices on the first floor. So I think it is one of the things that is reasonably revisited within this.
Okay. I had another one and it escaped me, so I'll come back to it.
So just as a more overarching way to look at this, and we talk about this a lot, when you create these plans, think about every small area plan, even the comprehensive plan, but focus on the small area plans. What do? We select essentially a random group of people and we bring them together. Now each one has, we're gonna select this many neighbors and this many planning commissioners, and so you put that group of people together and they do their best and they meet with the public and they generate a plan. But does that mean that is the perfect plan? Like they nailed it? That random group of people just came together and it is perfect? No, it's never perfect. So the idea of revisiting these and figuring out where we've done well and where we could do better is a good idea in general. So just want to put that out there.
Well, and I think what at least my experience has been, is that I view these as guidelines, right? And it's like, this is, and if it's not 100% on there, it's fine, but did we get a lot of it? And do we get the spirit of it? And one thing that I'm finding as a city council member though, is it's very difficult for the public to digest because it's so uncertain. And there's a lot of, and even between the Planning Commission and the City Council, they interpret it one way, we do another. Mick Johnson looks at the same project twice and says diametrically opposed responses to it. It is very uncertain. And so while it's wonderful to be able to talk about things and plan and be creative and everything, we love that, but it comes with a level of uncertainty, and that makes people uncomfortable. But then also, I'm concerned that we're gonna have to do TIF for everyone, and it was the give to get idea. If you're gonna get the height, you're gonna give us this, that, and how do we have a financial analysis of that? Because developers are saying, there's no way we could build this according to what you want without TIF. It's like, well, then you shouldn't be building a great big tall building maybe. And so I don't know the tools, if you guys thought about, you know, how do you say, no, this is a give to get and put your foot down on that?
So, again, we're going back years on this, but I think the give to get was in part a way to get developers to start doing things aligned with aspirations. We started out with aspirations. If you go through the plan, and even the first stage that Carrie highlighted, those are very aspirational statements about what we wanted to have happen in the Southdale area. And it was the guidelines that came on last as a way to hopefully operationalize a lot of the aspirational ideas that we had in the plan. But I think we were believing that there would be a point when the give to get would kind of go away because enough people had bought into the core ideas of the aspirations and the guidelines. You know, where that tipping point is, I don't think we've reached it yet, but and maybe we never will. But I wanted to reply to one other thing you were mentioning, that they are guidelines, and they'll never work if we're absolutely slavish to them, I believe. They're guidelines because there are many factors beyond just the design of a building or the public space around it that influences the design or the evolution of a building. And the city council will never have control of all of those features.
They can't be so firm as to dictate where, like what the lanes look like on a specific street until we see, I think sometimes that project. And I think that's where that ambiguity can be difficult too.
Or even things like parking counts, that we might think that they're controlled, but we put it in an ordinance. They're controlled by financial institutions. So we don't control that, and there's no way we ever can.
I know maybe some people don't always agree with the way I think about these plans, but I think of them as, it's like the bumpers you put up on a bowling alley when your kids are bowling. They kind of keep things in this range. And the whole purpose of these guidelines is to help planning commission and a city council, you know, hopefully have a focused discussion about what's important. You know, you create the principles or whatever. Those principles, if you think about it, they became such a focus of the discussion. To Julie's point, they were taken outside of the Southdale area. And I always wondered if that was really appropriate, right? Because the Southdale area has a scale and an identity that's unique, you know, to itself. And so why would we apply principles that were developed for that area in other places? Now, some of them are just good design principles, so I get why that would happen. But the point of it is focusing the conversation, so as a council, you can sort of have that conversation with the developer and kind of get where you need to get within some set of parameters that we can all agree on. I've always felt that Mick took a very hardline approach and his comments come across that way and puts the planning commission and the council in kind of a tough spot, right? Because it's like, this is good, this is bad. And I'm not sure it's ever really truly defined that way. There's always something in between.
So if you guys don't mind, I'll follow up, or do you want to go ahead? So you've sat on both the planning commission and the city council. How do we bridge this, if it's an interpretive conversation? And I understand, you know, we're talking about bumpers, but within those bumpers, there's a lot of this, right? How do we bridge the fact that we're having 9 people on the planning commission, 5 people on the city council, all with strong opinions, and the developer going, who do I listen to? And that's one of the things that I have found really frustrating, because you want to be respectful of each other, you know, but it's also, it makes for a lot of tension.
Yeah, it's hard to get everyone on the same page, and you're probably never going to get everyone on the same page. And you know, there are certain members of the planning commission that are really adamant about, you know, certain things, you know, pedestrian stuff like that. That maybe, you know, you think, at least I always thought, maybe going a little far, but I actually think it's served a good purpose because they take that approach. It pushes us all along just a little bit more than we might have. Probably never going where they want to go, but the conversation is valuable in terms of the idea. I've always been a proponent, and I know I've said it 100 times, and it's not gonna solve everything, but the thing I've always wanted to see when I was on the planning commission and when I was on the city council is, as we build these projects, we should get in a bus and go out and spend time. We should be walking around the Bower and talking about what works there. Why does it work there? And then we should go to ones that we don't feel as good about and talk about why do we not feel comfortable. If Julie's talking about a project she doesn't feel comfortable in, we should be standing out there and talking about what could have been different. And that's how you, I think, eventually start getting coalescing about, you know, what are you trying to achieve? You know, there's been a high turnover on the planning commission, so I think that makes it more difficult, right? Like if you went and did that trip, you know, a year later, you might have new people on. So, you know, I don't know how you kind of make that work over time, but I think it would be worth doing.
Can you go back to the slide that has the guidelines on there? You have one slide.
Almost look like a tape, yeah.
That one right there, those elements. So I don't know how to do this. I just have some comments, no questions. We do have a tendency, once something gets pen to paper, you can call it a guideline, you could call it a wish list, whatever you want to call it. It gets baked, and I think developers take that as gospel and they try to design to it. I think the residents take it as gospel and they react to it. And so there's this theory of, from a creativity standpoint, you reach a point where if you're so high level, you get more creativity. But to your bumper's point, it may not be focused enough, right? And if you go too low of a level, then you get too specific. And you still may not get what you really want because you need that playability within the model. And so I don't know the right way to do this, but I do feel like where we are today, I don't know that we have the right balance. Like, it should be a very short conversation if a medical building says, well, we have patients on the first floor, we want to be at this location, but if you make us put this glass there, we're going to have blinders up all the time. Like, that should have taken us, I don't know, 10 minutes to hear that and go, yeah, that makes sense. But it was, we talked about it quite a bit, and we're still not quite sure how we would do that. And so I think that, to me, says we need a different balance, but I'm not sure how to solve that. And so that'd be one thing. If we go forward and we review the guidelines, trying to figure out what's the right level would make sense. And so like an extreme would be if we said in these certain blocks, we want it to be walkable. Like, that's very high level. That could be what we have. That could be done in pedestrian pathways, or there's a myriad of ways to do that. But then you have your discussion around, to your point, at the site, well, how are we going to get walkability for this site? What does it need to connect to? And then you're having this dialogue that leads to a project that meets that guideline, right? And it just lives differently, perhaps, for that project than it might someplace else. But connectivity would be something that we would value in that area. So then, all right, how are we going to do that? So there might be a different way of making this live and breathe that gets us to the right outcome, but I think that'd be worth looking into. And then the other thing I just have to say, all of our ethnic diversity is in the Southeast quadrant. And like, there's no diversity, ethnic diversity. I'm talking about people of color, right, live in those areas. If you look at the map, it's pink with the way we think about ethnicity. And they just aren't engaged in the process. And I think we're far past the point where we allow ourselves to say, well, maybe they don't want to be involved, because that's kind of how we've thought about it a little bit. I think we're past that point. Now we got to figure out, do we have the right engagement models to ensure that we can pull people in? Because in this conversation, the folks that are going to be using these services more than perhaps some others are the people who live there. And so really creating a way to make sure, maybe they're not going to be on the planning commission, all right, that's fine. Maybe they're not going to be selected for the working group, but we got to have some way to ensure that we're getting engagement from the, I'll say, the broader community, really targeting those areas when we go back and we look at this again. That's it.
We are in the process of having conversations about setting up some sort of like apartment manager, like organization of some sort, so that we could get in there more frequently and have some of that engagement. So if you have a group that's working on it, that may be something that we could kind of take the show on the road a little bit and reach out specifically to those buildings, bring it to them.
I'm just sitting here thinking about when this all started. We had 7,200 come with a project idea, and the council at that time sees this was just the first of projects to come in the Southdale district, that area from crosstown to 494, York to France. So this ended up, after all those 4 years of work, being a pretty extraordinary piece of work, because what we were doing was looking at overheads of the Southdale district, and all we saw was asphalt and concrete. There wasn't green anywhere, except for the promenade around Centennial Lakes. And so it's a long process to get to what we think could be there in terms of almost a village unto itself. But we're making progress, and some of those, as you called them in the design experience guidelines, the framework, the building blocks, the width of the street, the sunlight, public spaces, view corridors, building scale, landscaping, street lighting, courtyards and pocket parks. Those things are, we've been doing that, and we're coming on some of those things every time we have a project out there. And to the point about the TIF, I think that, you know, as you ask people to take expensive property and cut it up in part for the public good, the public has to be a partner in it some way, somehow, and that ends up probably through TIF, if we're gonna get what we want out there. And this, one of the things that's always tempered me is this 200 by 200 foot grid idea that you came up with from the city of Portland. Laudable on its face, but the project we're gonna look at tonight is a great example of 22 acres with a building that stretches through 4 buildings with basically a ground level skyway system that you just can't cut it up, to me, and create new streets all the way through there that would accommodate vehicular traffic. Now, they've done that with respect to pedestrian movements, but it's, you can't look at these things as any more than guidelines, because they can't be principles, because they don't work all the time. And the reason we never looked at medical, I think, was because medical had its own campus. It never creeped south to 66th Street. And now it's creeping south to 66th Street. I mean, it's scattered all the way down France Avenue, all the way to Trian. So there are things probably worth taking a look at again to see if we need to reset some focus. But I would say for the two of you, you know, it was a pretty extraordinary piece of work. You ought to be really proud of the sort of guardrails and guidelines you gave us to help figure things out in that district.
You know, one thing you said that really made me think about this is, and I think it was the US Bank, one of the first iterations when I was on the council, not the one that, you know, I think it ultimately got voted on when I was done. But what struck me is, you know, sometimes we look at the plans, the guidelines, whatever you wanna call them, and we think, so we're removing a bank that was the suburban model of suburban models, right? It just sort of flowed and took up lots of green space or whatever. And so they're gonna redevelop this, they're starting to kind of try to break up the blocks, but they wanna do a few things that, doesn't feel quite right. Now, you could look at that and say, absolutely not, but you didn't, and part of the reason you didn't is I think you understood that it's an evolution. Sometimes you don't get to the picture and the guidelines in one swing, right? Like it's gonna take a couple iterations and things are gonna happen, and it's moving in that direction. And that's kind of, are we directionally heading, in the same place? Which is, I think you did a nice job. I think all of you some of you, I don't know, some of you did a nice job. But I mean, it's like, how are we gonna get there? And it's not always clean.
Parking's another good example. You touched on it. I know this has been a concern of Kate's, but, when you talk to people that are in the development business down in the North Loop, they say that the multifamily units that have the highest rate of vacancy are the ones that are underparked. And lenders, I had a developer tell me, you can tell us anything you want about how we're gonna park this thing. It's up to the lenders. If they don't think we have this adequately parked in order to attract the number of people that are gonna work there, we're not gonna be able to borrow any money to do the project anyway.
I think there's still a market aspect to that though too, because we could create the most engaging, walkable district, and people, and we've actually said this before, and as we've done planning projects, on the weekend, somebody's gonna want their Miata, and it's gotta be parked somewhere. So that we need to have parking spaces somewhere for the car that almost is never used. People are gonna want it. Councilmember Jackson, I wanted to respond to one thing about, you said, who does the developer listen to? And I think it's a really good question. And I think when you look at these, the first time we brought these out, people said, they sound good, but what do they even mean? And so I think there were a set of questions that we came up for each one that would encourage a dialogue between the planning commission, the developer, the city council, the developer, even the city council and the planning commission. And when you really look at the guidelines, as you've kind of been hinting at, there is no hard and fast rule there. It's not an ordinance. They can be modified, but you get there through the dialogue that you have. And as Michael was saying, there's the shifting to allow certain things to happen to gain the greater good, as opposed to precluding anything from happening. So when we look at these, if we can't have a process that encourages a dialogue, we won't get anywhere. And I think one of the things that we all recognize going back to 2008 is I think when the comprehensive plan actually encouraged a sketch plan process to be put in place. And we have never really satisfied the overall goals of a sketch plan to be a sketch with a great conversation attached to it. And it got to the point, even like with Estelle, where they created an amazing video. They invested hundreds of thousands of dollars on a project that we never said we wanted. And we needed to get back to the point where we could have the dialogue first around some things that may be mostly right, but maybe not completely addressing every instance for every small area of a district. So I don't know how you get the developer to listen, but I think if you're trying to be just explicitly responsive to something that's written on paper and becomes almost wholly because of that, I think we're gonna miss it. And I think you need to get the dialogue going with the developer. And as we've had the chance over the last couple of months to be working with the developer at 7200, 7250 of Macy's, and there actually has been a great dialogue about design. And when they brought the sketch plan forward the last time, it was a simple plan view diagram that illustrated some of the principles that we're trying to get to. And if we can agree, incrementally agree to certain things that are in there, how should circulation happen across the site? What should the pattern of land uses be? And keep building from there instead of trying to get to it all at once. I think we're all better served.
We've had a couple, I think, of ideas of potential change, but having been with these guidelines from the start to now, like, what are the 2 or 3 things that each of you would change in it first?
I'm gonna let you guys think about that for a
Yeah,
minute,
do,
because one
thank
thing
you.
that we do have to change is, Southdale Mall. It can't, if we're gonna keep Southdale Mall, it's on the bias, it's not flush, it's not a grid, and it never will be unless we tear it down and rebuild it. So we need to resolve, does Southdale Mall get its own little sub plan? Or do we have to say it's obsolete and it's gonna be turned into this grid? Because when we looked at the lifetime thing, that was a very serious problem. And I would ask that that's something the planning commission think about changing. Because I like the fact that we have a historic mall in our town, and I support it. But under the Southdale guidelines, it doesn't work. And it can't work because it's big and it's on the bias.
It's also outside of our control, right? Like, it
No.
is,
It's not our property.
right?
Right, but
We don't
the
own
way the
that property.
guidelines that we have say that it doesn't conform, and so I think it should,
They
conform.
don't, the way our code is set up, they don't have to do much over there in terms of achieving approval from us.
Right.
They can do basically anything they want on their own property.
Yeah, and MEC even did some design work to work around the mall where it's not that classic grid. Simon wasn't real, they weren't real enthusiastic about what we had come up with, or,
So I actually don't have necessarily suggestions on the guidelines, but I know I'm the other extreme on the council. My focus would be process. And so is there a process that we can come up with that is maybe similar to what you suggested earlier? If there's a project, if we can nail this is sketch, we're gonna come out to this site, we have some outcomes that we want in the district that we agree with, and we're gonna walk around that site and with that developer and kind of massage this thing to figure out which of these outcomes we're gonna be able to achieve. We don't do that today.
Right.
And the one thing that I will unequivocally say is process trumps turnover every day. If our process says for a project, we're gonna do this, when we get 2 new council members on, that's the process. Here's how we do it. These are the outcomes. That's the guideline. Here's how we do it. And people will just fall in line. And you still have the conversation, right? But I think we get further if we can figure out a process that we can live within to make these guidelines and principles come to life. And Julie's been trying to talk for 20 minutes.
Thank you, James. First, I want to say I agree with a lot of what people have been saying. The other thing is, we talk about the grid, all right? And I think it really limits imagination. And you can say, this is to provide sort of a grounding and a beginning of the conversation. But if you think about it, you couldn't have the Galleria, you couldn't have Target. The beautiful plans that Hennepin County has put together for the library, you couldn't have that. And so I think that grid is really very much a restriction. And I do love the fact that Southdale, the mall, is on the bias. I love the fact that Restoration Hardware has to fill a corner and reflected that bias, as did Shake Shack. And in fact, you look at all 4 of those corners, they're not responding to the grid, they're defying the grid. And I think when I saw the Macy's plan, I was just, oh, here we go again, the grid. But, going back to the US Bank project, the plan was to take down that suburban bank no matter what. And the original ask was to put that bank along 70th, okay? And so you would have had, if they had not been told, it should be something more grand. And if they had not been sent back to develop, this really elaborate plan, we would have had a bank created a long time ago on 70th. It would have been a more organic kind of process. Who knows if there would have been another building that came up without having, this elaborate scenario that may not come to fruition. So I think we really need to take another look at those guidelines. And also, I think it's good we're having this conversation, but I don't think it's necessarily going to encourage a developer to come forward with a plan that is as free and as open as, say, Hennepin County was able to do with their site, because they won't have the confidence that they can do it. And I do wonder what we're missing out, seeing come before us, because basically imagination is being limited. And I do also, one thing, I am concerned about tree canopy, and as I look at the developments that's taken place, and especially thinking about the experience of walking along the sidewalks, there's not a lot of shade. There's not a lot of cooling, for people who are there during the summer trying to get from point A to point B. So I would like us to think about, some of the goals of the climate action plan, and think about whether we're losing tree canopy because of the grid and pushing buildings closer. A lot of the landscaping does not include trees that will have significant canopy. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Sorry, I missed your hand in the air there. Thanks, James.
One thing I would say about the grid is it's not, and Michael, you can correct me because you were part of all the planning conversations, but if you think about where we started, the Salta area is just essentially a collection of super blocks, right? We talked about how you look at the aerial photo and it just stands out from the whole region, these massive blocks of parking or big box or the mall or whatever. So the whole idea of the grid isn't just, to create a grid for grid's sake, it's to create porosity in these super blocks. And whether that's for vehicles, for pedestrians. So when you create this grid, you're creating additional streets that over time will connect. And so that local traffic, when you're going from Target to Lund's or wherever, you don't have to constantly go back out on France Avenue, which is where we're creating the traffic problems and creating an environment that nobody wants to be part of. So you have to kind of think about what's the big picture? What are we really trying to, establish? Whether we picked, the Portland grid at this many feet or some other grid at another, I'm not even sure that's the important part. And we knew right away, like, this is when I was on the council seeing the results. It's like, wait a minute, Hennepin County hates every one of these proposals because we're potentially creating, connecting points to France Avenue. They don't want it. But at some point, there might be some argument that that's not great to have too many connection points on France Avenue, but we do need to get people back on these parallel streets, and that is happening as a result of these guidelines. Each one of these developments is getting us a little bit closer. So Julie, I know it sounds like you're not thrilled about the US Bank, splitting that into 4 pieces. What I like is that it's the beginning where I don't have to go out on France Avenue to get, on that 2-block stretch. And that's, that's where the little bank building is blocking that street, right? But I'm like, 20 years from now, I don't know that that's there. So that street will be there. So we're setting ourselves up again over time to get to that place.
That's an example for me, it's kind of an internal grid that I liked, that we started carving up something in that fashion. And we even looked at potential north-south through street running on this, would be the east side of the next strip mall over. And so I think you're making a good point that over time, it's gonna change. I thought Julie's point was interesting too.
I think we do need a safety plan though, because it is going to be over time. And if there is no safety plan for getting from where it is a driveway that a pedestrian might not expect a car to suddenly turn into, and there's no flashing light or anything like that, it is a risk to pedestrians and bikers. So what is the answer to that, you know, like maybe in 20 years it'll be a street, but it's not one now.
Well, you've got that same issue at Byerly's, Lund's Byerly's. As you walk along France Avenue, there's gonna be a lot of curb cuts that a pedestrian has to be mindful of.
It's a fair point, Julie. I mean, I think it's a good point and something we have to wrestle with these, you know, if we're creating more opportunities to turn into these sites.
Councilmember Agnew asked a couple minutes ago, two or three most important things, and with just a little bit of time, I was able to come up with at least two. I think the most important is that these have a focus on the experience of the space between buildings. And there are guidelines that apply to buildings, but I think the guidelines that are about the space between are far more important. When you look at the Southdale area plan in its totality, it's not a guideline issue, but the ability to look for things like the extension of the promenade, even north, even the far-reaching notion of spanning crosstown to reach Strachauer Park. There are some really big moves that have served the Southdale area well, and if you take that idea and you apply it, if you kind of apply it in retrospect to Centennial Lakes, the spaces of Centennial Lakes are great. The buildings are completely disposable in my mind. They're not great architecture, but the spaces work great between them. And I think that's what we should be looking for, because that's where the experience of a space happens.
Yeah,
That was
like,
one.
You're talking
Well,
about.
that was two. I was trying to make it two. I'm still short one.
Down on the Macy's site is another example of a potential project that gets that 8 acres carved up and greener.
Yeah.
And you create those view sheds, you create more light. The setbacks off France, I think, have always been, that was an important element of what the work you did. The height of buildings along France Avenue, that 65-foot setback, all those things were really good design elements.
And I think you mentioned Southdale. I think the plan, if I remember, talked about some kind of a large public space somehow on the Southdale block, kind of the mall commons or something. Not a little small plaza or parklet, but something big. And I think that helps begin to change the way Southdale works. You're not gonna be able to change that building, those walls, those masses. I think you have to look at how you reshape public space around it. And that's actually something that, as a city, we can begin to control a whole lot more than we control the design of a building.
So to kind of feed off that a little bit, looking again at the Macy's site, if I remember correctly, that space east-west, just like at the new library, is pedestrian space, isn't it? I don't think that's envisioned as a street. Tell me what your feelings are about the spaces in between being non-motorized. Well, maybe e-bike, but, because I think the library site does have the grid, but it's not for cars. It's for bikes and pedestrians.
Yeah, that's where I think if we're too slavish to the 200-foot grid, we're not gonna get where we wanna be. I think there's a notion about providing, Michael mentioned the term porosity, but breaking up the scale of buildings so that there's more routes around and through. Not all of them should be in a car. In fact, many of them should not be in a car.
You know, the most important thing about a grid is where you break it. I mean, and that's just the fact. Think about any really great place that has a grid, and what you remember most is the unique places where it's broken. And I always say, you know, cities are just a collection of mistakes, wonderful mistakes that add up into something really unique and wonderful. And to me, and Michael hit it exactly, this is about creating public realm. And the whole Southdale area guidelines, to me, it's like, I could almost care less about the buildings. What are we doing to create places where we can all walk through and participate here in a way that we never could for decades, right? If you didn't get in a car and drive around the super blocks, you weren't really part of this. And that's the evolution we're trying to create. The buildings are gonna come and go, but that public realm is gonna be here. And so that's what we're really here to guide and make sure that happens.
So I kind of want to go back to James's point about the process. And this is a question for Carrie and Bill. When we're talking with people who are thinking of building in Edina, we have you know, we built those environmental questionnaires. So if they weren't going to be with the green, before we had a green building code, we asked questions. Is handing them, and it's just been long enough that I should have pulled out my guidelines, but I had big picture in mind. But can we start with a questionnaire before we start talking ideas? And do we? And how well does that work when we're talking to people who are coming here?
Yeah, so we don't start with the questionnaire, it's really the guidelines. But as I was putting that PowerPoint together, I was thinking a lot of those projects that you see up there that we like were developed before we finalized the guidelines, and we just had the questionnaire that we handed to people. So maybe that's something that we should do, is get them thinking with that questionnaire, rather than now they just go to the guidelines and they start designing.
Yeah.
So that's a really good point.
Carrie, in the Southdale plan, didn't we begin to describe a better process for how sketch plan review could work? And I can't remember if it made it in there or not, but we had some ideas about the way that it happens now and the way that it might be reshaped.
Yeah, it's in there, and you try to get that to the developers, but they have an idea and they want to impress you all at sketch plan. That's kind of what it comes down to. They're not willing to just start with a blank slate and come in and have a discussion. I've been trying for years to get them to do that, but they just don't.
I feel like we've seen somewhere where they do, but then we're like, oh, there's not enough here. We don't know how to think about this.
Yeah.
And so I think that we also need to bring that back as potentially a training opportunity for ourselves, the planning commission, for how should we tee this up around the process? Because we might then not set the stage for us to expect it from developers.
What I recall is when you first proposed that we do a sketch plan, it was the idea that they could come with the most rudimentary sort of sketch and just bounce it off of us for ideas. And that's evolved into them doing the same thing we used to do at preliminary approval. That's, they'd spend thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands of dollars to come for a sketch plan. It's not what it was intended to be.
Yeah, back when I was chair of the planning commission, even before I was chair, just being on the planning commission, it felt so uncomfortable, because I knew, because the profession I'm in, I knew how much money had been spent to create the drawings that were coming to us for the first time. I'm looking around like, none of us want this, but there's so much pressure in this room right now because of the investment that's been made. And, you know, we've got a room full of people that don't want it, and we don't particularly want it. And so it just felt like getting them to invest less was kind of a no-brainer. But as Carrie says, they still, I don't think they're coming in with, you know, the stack of required, you know, the sewer grate details aren't done yet, thankfully, but they're still coming in too glossy.
Well, the only way they could come in before sketch plan was to file for preliminary approval.
Right.
So then they spend tens of thousands of dollars, and we would tell them no.
Yeah.
Or yeah, maybe, but still.
To respond to Carolyn's question, so developers like anything that will reduce their risk, right? So when you want to move into a community, you've got an opportunity to acquire land and build something. You never want to go in cold and spend the hundreds of thousands of dollars to have an idea, only to be shot down and say, oh no, the building really should have been turned 45 degrees, or it should be this, or it should be that. So while developers don't always agree with everything in our Southdale plan or in our guidelines, because it tends to cost them money, overall, I think they appreciate the community articulating the goals that we're looking for. So in an absence of that, I think it would be a detriment to development here. But there's always room for improvement and clarity. The most frequent question I've heard in the beginning when we talk to developers is that 200 by 200 grid, where we ask, my site, it doesn't lay out to be 200 by 200, it lays out to be 275 to 275. I mean, so they always ask, do I have to comply with that number? And I think both Carrie and I have usually given pretty clear direction that, you've got the space that you have, so that's our goal in a perfect world, but our world isn't perfect because everything's been built out. So work with what you have and we'll be flexible. But that's always the first question that comes up, is that 200 grid.
We're in a much better place than we were pre-2015, but could use some refinement.
Does this give you the guidance that you need to help?
I think it does. I think I'm hearing that we want to move forward with the planning commission and come up with some kind of a process. We've even talked about, this idea came from Michael and Mike, is get the planning commission out and visit some of the sites and talk about what's worked, what hasn't. To James's earlier.
Nora, but not a public participation.
I'll get them later.
The thing that we struggle with, of course, is that notification of a public meeting. You know, we have to go out in smaller groups or it becomes a public meeting, but we can navigate that.
Well, and what did we do when we had the commissions go out and look at public works? Remember when we did that?
We advertise it, we put it on the calendar.
Yeah, so people could come with if they wanted to, right?
No, because there's not so much room on the bus. They knew we were doing it,
Okay.
so we had to advertise that we were doing
Well,
it.
you could tell them approximately where you're gonna be, and they could certainly, if you're gonna go walk around the outside of the Bower, they
Yeah,
could
we had 3
meet at
stops,
the Bower.
and we were hitting those 3, so.
Yeah, so just, you have an expert right here and how to do it.
Yeah, and maybe you divide it up with a time range of, we're gonna be from 5:30 to 6 PM at this site, and then you just have to move, so that way people can predict it and show up for the one they wanna participate in or see.
I just don't think we should let the public meeting laws prevent us from going out and doing, you know, invite
right.
people, make sure they can get there.
Well, like I said, we've done that, so
Yeah.
it can be done.
Yeah, so I'm, just to be clear, I definitely support, I would just say generically moving forward, but would want you to come back with what that means, right? What are the, what's gonna be done, what are the expected outcomes, so that we're clear on what we're going after in this process.
Yeah, we can sure do that.
And I think also, how does it compare with all of the other priorities of the planning commission? I think that there were a few, they have a heavy agenda.
They do. Our agendas have been relatively light. I'm thinking of just working this in for work sessions for them.
Yeah, I just know that there have been some items that have carried over now a couple of years, and so would love to see progress on those too.
Fine, well taken.
So,
Go ahead, Carol.
one other thing that came up with the project we were gonna look at tonight, and that is, you know, the concept of, existing buildings. And, you know, sort of, are we expecting people to raise everything to the ground when they do it? Because that's really what this whole, you know, the second time I've looked at 6800 France, and they're wrestling with, we like these buildings, we don't want to take them down, but you can't build a street between them if you don't take them down. So I guess that's something that we as a council have to wrestle with, but also I just think the whole thing is, we're re-envisioning the area and stuff, but how in this transition era do we say, well, maybe we don't have to take every building down to do this? And did you guys wrestle with that at all?
Well, I think that was, I do recall that in the discussions that we had with Mick, there were places where there wasn't a 200 by 200 grid because there were existing buildings. I don't think he recognized it across the district, but I think he recognized the potential wouldn't be there across the entirety of the district. And I think it's also probably not reasonable to imagine that every building would come down in the time frame of this plan, which he would, you know, looks out over 40 years. We will still have a lot of these buildings in that 40-year time span. I think the focus, and Mayor, you mentioned this, was really to look at the expanses of parking and to begin reimagining first how that would happen and how that would impact other buildings, the smaller buildings, the office building at 6600. Probably I could see that being difficult to remove just because of its mass, but some of the smaller buildings, I think developers could consider them to be not throwaways, but easier to deal with in a whole redevelopment scheme.
Thanks to the two of you for answering the call whenever we
Yeah, glad to do
need
it.
your guidance and your wisdom. Really appreciate you coming over and visiting with us, and it's always good to see you, both of you. Don't see you enough.
Thanks.
To be here.
Anything else, council members? All right, Julie, anything else?
Just to reiterate James's point about including people who live in the Southdale area, I think that really, really, really needs to happen as we move forward.
Yeah, that's what we did with the design experience guidelines we did,
Yeah, it was,
including you, that's your neighborhood.
it was largely people, even in the second stage when we expanded, we looked particularly at people who lived in the Southdale area. They were hard to get to participate, but I think the expanded group included only people who lived in that district.
Okay, all right, we stand adjourned, we'll see you downstairs.